Thank you. Good afternoon. So like Rob said, I'm going to talk about reading the fine print in Edgefield, South Carolina. And so, of course, the first thing I'm going to do is start talking about some area that is not in Edgefield, South Carolina. So I'm not going to follow directions, basically. So first, and I should mention as a caveat that I set this up in case studies because most of my speaking experience in the past has been for morbidity and mortality conference. And for those of you that are not in healthcare, that means that you've either killed someone or hurt them, and you have to give a lecture in front of the Department of Surgery or the Department of Medicine and basically explain why you did what you did and why it was wrong, and then be reprimanded by answering 1,000 questions that you don't know the answer to, or attempting to answer, I should say. So when I looked at the program and I saw where I was in the schedule and that I was sandwiched between Kate's presentation and Dr. Hoare's presentation, I thought I would kind of talk about both of those things, but in a case study fashion, in an effort to use documents to obtain indirect evidence that gives more direct evidence related to Edgefield District ceramics. So this is a beautiful water cooler, which most of you have probably seen next door in the Mariner Gallery. If you haven't, please take some time to take a peek. And as Rob mentioned this morning, Thomas Chandler checked into the conference on Facebook. And so this has been an interesting social media experience with Thomas Chandler on Facebook. In fact, at one point this year, there were 2 Thomas Chandlers on Facebook. I was told by Thomas Chandler 1 that he reported Thomas Chandler 2 as impersonating him. And Facebook deactivated the account. And I will also say that I am not Thomas Chandler, which several people in this room have asked me. So case 1, I'm sorry to say to Kate, I'm going to talk about basically Thomas Chandler being dead, and you do really seem to love him. So fueled by the Facebook drama of Thomas Chandler 1 and 2, there was a discussion about which cemetery Thomas Chandler may be buried in. So reviewing documents, first we see a North Carolina Whig newspaper entry for the pending probate estate sale, and you can see near the center where they talk about selling earthenwares. Down at the bottom, you see Thomas Chandler's wife, Margaret Chandler, as an administrator of the estate, and you see William M. Durham, who was a son of Isaac Durham, who is directly related to Margaret Durham Chandler, although I'm unsure of the exact relationship. So next, we'll kind of figure out where we are. And so what you'll see is a Google Earth image of York County, South Carolina, and Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. And you can see Charlotte, and then you should be able to see some pins that I've dropped. And those are churches that I think, or church cemeteries, I should say, where I think Thomas Chandler could possibly be buried. And you say, well, why do you think that? Well, exploring Thomas Chandler's probate documents, you see here a portion of the probate, which is interesting because it's actually a copy of open accounts of a record book related to Thomas Chandler and stoneware for the years 1853 and 1854. If you look, ironically, I didn't realize at the time I was doing this, I separated York County and Mecklenburg County by red and blue. And so with an upcoming election, maybe I shouldn't have chosen those 2 colors, but I did. So you see the first red arrow at the top, and that is William Isaiah Clausen, who actually was the first mayor of York or Yorkville, South Carolina. And then the remainder of the blue arrows show you individuals who in 1850 and or 1860 were living in the Steel Creek Township of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. So if we go back, you can see here in Steel Creek, I've tagged 3 different churches. So what I thought possibly I could do would be extract information from who Thomas Chandler and his family was selling ceramics to, and see if there was a pattern and if perhaps there was a church connection. Because as most of you know, when you do 19th century research, a lot of things go back to religion and church. So when you find a grave, you see the Blackstock Cemetery in York County, South Carolina, and you see the individuals that are listed there that were listed previously in the probate document, and then you see the Steel Creek Presbyterian Church. So a lot of people buried in similar places. Interestingly, if you look at the letters of administration, you have William Johnston, John Potts, and Moses Hart, who signed with Margaret Chandler and William Durham in 1854. And if we add them to the list, we have some compelling evidence that Thomas Chandler and his family had a relationship with the Steel Creek Presbyterian Church in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Interestingly, compounding on Mr. Wingard's article in Ceramics in America about Thomas Chandler, further research shows that this particular piece of pottery has indirect relationship to both of these cemeteries. So, do I know where Thomas Chandler is buried? No, I do not. But this is just an illustration of using documents to extract information and correlate them to make conclusions. So the next case, I'm going to talk about Isaac Durham, who is a longtime potter in Edgefield, the Edgefield district of South Carolina. And I actually worked on this particular question for the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources about 2 years ago and supplied them with some information. And so at the bottom of the screen, you see a mark that looks like a slash and a slash and a D, or some people have said that it's an I and a D to stand for Isaac Durham, and associates him with a pottery in the Edgefield district. So if we look at Google Maps again, I just wanted to kind of show you where we are in space and time. And so you'll see the small square is an overlay of the 1825 Robert Mills map of the Edgefield district. You can see Columbia, you can see Atlanta, just so you know where you are. So we'll come a little bit closer and you can see the overlay with present day South Carolina. And here we have the Robert Mills Atlas. And so the areas we're going to be talking about regarding this case are Pottersville, which is located just north of Edgefield town proper. And then we're going to talk about the Shaw's Creek area where the Colin Rhodes pottery was, the Siegler pottery was, and the Phoenix Factory pottery was. Incidentally, Amos Landrum also had a pottery in that area. And then we'll talk about the Kirksey's Crossroad area where Thomas Chandler was a potter before he left the Edgefield area. And here's a beautiful piece that is stamped Pottersville that you can find across the street in the Mariner Gallery. So we'll start in 1810 using the 1810 census. Pottersville was a small community, as I said, located north of Edgefield proper. And there's been some research done to reconstruct the parcels. So what we do know, based on parcel reconstruction or plat reconstruction, is that Samuel Landrum, who is the father of Abner Landrum, John Landrum, and Amos Landrum, who were all involved in the stoneware industry, lived in Pottersville. You'll look below the last line, and you see the name David Gerganis. Now, David Gerganis was not a potter, but he did live in Pottersville, and I'm going to use him to connect Isaac Durham to Pottersville in a future slide. Next, we have the estate of Dr. Samuel Landrum, who I mentioned in the previous slide, and he died in the year 1814. And so reviewing his probate document, we see the date 1814, and then we see notes of land, and you see Isaac Durham paying purchase, basically renting land from Samuel Landrum in the year 1814, which places him at Pottersville. Next, we see an additional page of the probate dated 1819, and again, we have Durham, here misspelled D-U-R-U-M, again, paying rent, living at Pottersville. Unfortunately, Isaac Durham is not found in the 1820 census. Conveniently, Abner Landrum and John Presley are found in the 1820 census. I do think it is compelling evidence that if he paid rent in Pottersville in 1819, that he possibly could have still been there in 1820. Connecting that to a dated piece of stoneware, we have this bottle, which you can see across the street, which is attributed to Abner Landrum and dated July 20th, 1820, which would have been not long after the census was recorded. And here we have a business agreement. Around the year 1828, Abner Landrum, who founded Pottersville and the pottery stoneware factory there, sold the factory to Harvey and Reuben Drake. Harvey and Reuben subsequently around 1830 decided that as brothers they needed to have a business agreement with each other. And this is that agreement. And so you'll see the name Gerganus, and then you'll see the name Isaac Durham. And I apologize for the image quality, but the microfilm rollers at the South Carolina archives are quite dusty. And you'll see it says, a tract of land called the Gerganus Place where Isaac Durham now lives. So now we have Isaac Durham still living at Pottersville in 1830. Next, we have the 1830 census. We have Harvey and Reuben Drake, which is the Pottersville stoneware manufactory, and we have Abner Landrum. And then down at the bottom, in the last line, we do have Isaac Durham, living near Pottersville in 1830. So the next dated piece of stoneware that we can relate to the Pottersville area is actually this beautiful piece, which is next door in the Mariner Gallery, and it says, Drake, Rhodes, and Company, Improved Stoneware, Edgefield Courthouse, South Carolina, 1836. And so what we do know is that the firm, Drake, Rhodes, and Company, actually dissolved on the 1st of September 1836. And we also know that it became a company on January 1st that year. So using the date on the jug as well as the newspaper articles, you can narrow the date of this particular piece being made between January 1st and September 1st of 1836. And I do have a comment that is actually not included about this piece. Yesterday, I actually found some documents related to Thomas Chandler being stationed at the Augusta Arsenal in 1836, conveniently. And based on those documents, if one proposed that Chandler actually decorated this piece, based on the military record, then the piece would have been made between January 1st, 1836 and June 1st, 1836. So that further narrows the window if you do attribute the decoration to Thomas Chandler. So then we know that the folks at Pottersville dissolved and they basically moved to Shaw's Creek, which partially was because Colin Rhodes married Amos Landrum's daughter. And we have a beautiful piece which is in a private collection that says Shaw's Creek Pottery, 1839. And you'll see in the newspaper articles, you have Colin Rhodes selling his house in Pottersville, and then you also have the dissolution of Rhodes, Ramey, and Gibbs. So just to remind everybody where we are in space, so we're in the year 1839, and we're now down here at Shaw's Creek. We were up here at Pottersville in Edgefield. So in 1840, we have a great entry of Isaac Durham, Thomas M. Chandler, Colin Rhodes, and Robert Mathis, or Matthews, and then we have Matthews and Rhodes. And so you say, well, what is Matthews and Rhodes? Well, that happens to be Phoenix Factory. So here you have the first advertisement of the Phoenix Factory pottery in April of 1840, and you have a top view of a beautiful piece across the street in the Mariner Gallery that says Phoenix Factory, Edgefield District, South Carolina, and then on the back side you see a stamp which is an impressed serifed capital letter L. So then what happens to Isaac Durham? Well, in 1843, in January, you find him supposed to be in court with Colin Rhodes because Colin Rhodes has loaned him money and he has not paid him back. So here we have Colin Rhodes versus Isaac Durham, and you see that it was a default judgment, and that could mean several things. He didn't show up to court that day. He didn't show up with evidence that he didn't owe the money. But the last entry of Isaac Durham, he finally gets up to Kirksey's Crossroads, which is where he's most often attributed to ceramics, in 1843, based on the first mark I showed, the letter D. The only mention I've been able to find of Isaac Durham at this area, rather than this area, is in a conveyance between John Trapp and another individual saying that he lives as a neighboring land border. After that time, he disappears from the record. Therefore, I conclude that he's an unexplored potter. There's unknown evidence about him. He spent a long time at Pottersville. He was at Shaw's Creek at Phoenix Factory. What did his pottery look like? Is it attributable? Is there a mark to be attributed to him outside of the original mark I showed, since it seems that he was only there for a short time? And those are questions that I cannot answer. Perhaps someone in the audience would have something to contribute. And then last, here's a jar by Thomas Chandler that is also next door, dated 1844. So the year following the conveyance that I just showed, made when Thomas Chandler was in a partnership with Reverend John Trapp at Kirksey's Crossroads. So the third case and final case that I'm going to discuss is basically how I got into this in the first place, which is what several people have asked me this weekend and in previous gatherings. About 3 years ago, I was volunteering at the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina, and I was working with Carl Steen, an archaeologist that many of you in the room know, and I was very enthusiastic. What are we going to do next? When are we going to do it? Where are we going to go? How are we going to find it? And for those of you that know Carl, that probably really annoyed him, if you know him personally. So I think he wanted to give me an assignment and get me out of his hair, to be honest. And so he said, I need you to find F.E. Justice. And I said, okay, well, I'll look. So who is F.E. Justice? And I have a subtitle there, Back to the Future, because we're going to jump around in space and time. We're going to be in Edgefield and Aiken counties, but we're going to jump around in time. So at one point, we'll be in 1880, but we may hop back to the 1840s and vice versa. So just to get our bearings, so this is the county line. The green line that you see is the county line between Edgefield and Aiken County. Edgefield is on the left and Aiken County is on the right. You will see a pin on Google Earth that says Springfield Church, and Springfield Church is an African-American church that was founded during Reconstruction, and it was actually founded on land that was donated to the church founders by the Miles and Landrum families. And the Miles and Landrum families are two of the main names you hear when you discuss Edgefield stoneware, in particular that of Reverend John Landrum, Benjamin Franklin Landrum, his son, and Lewis J. Miles, his son-in-law. Lewis J. Miles is probably most often mentioned because you hear him in association with information about the enslaved potter now known as David Drake. So if you look at the pin, the yellow pin that's been dropped, if you drew a circle and you extended it out In about a 5-mile radius, you would find the Benjamin Franklin Landrum pottery, you would find the Lewis J. Miles pottery, and you would find the Miles Mill pottery, which was started by Lewis Miles and after he died, managed by his son, John Lewis Miles. So we're in the vicinity of several stoneware factories during the middle portion, actually beginning, middle, encompassing most of the 19th century. So when Carl gave me this assignment, he sent me a picture of these 2 tombstones, which actually are in the collection of the South Carolina State Museum in Columbia. These are they're actually not flat. They're kind of a half moon shape. They have throwing ridges on the back. They appear to have been wheel thrown in a cylinder and then cut in half and flattened out. They're alkaline glazed stoneware. And where you see the white letters, remarkably, the letters are actually kaolin that has been cut out in the shape of the letter and actually it's been incised and applied within the stoneware clay. So I found this very interesting because it reminded me of listening to collectors talk about face jugs and the use of kaolin as eyes and teeth. So first, naive, I thought, well, I'll research the people that died, the names on the tombstones, and see what I can find about them. And the answer is not much. So next, I thought, well, let me find justice. And so here we have F.E. Justice Maker. So we have tombstones, and we have an identified maker. I looked in the 1870 census, no justice. Since I assumed justice was African American, I thought, well, maybe there were justice families in the area that were large slaveholders. So I looked for them, and they're not there either. So last, I thought, well, maybe I should work forward. Before I go to the next slide, I want to call attention to the letter R and the letter F in this slide, which will be important in an upcoming slide, in the way they're made and the way they're shaped. And like I said, I found the tombstones exceptionally interesting because they're related to an African American cemetery. They were found in the basically trash pile at the Springfield Church, where I just showed you a map, which I just showed you on the map, in the mid-'80s. So they're related to the Miles and Landrum potteries. They're related to the potteries where Dave worked and where some of his apprentices, like Mark Jones, worked. So could I find out more? And these 3 lovely fellas on the screen can be seen across the street in the gallery. So first I started looking for African American potters, and this is actually 1880. So we've kind of moved up about 10 years at minimum. And then number 1 on the line, it's Wash Miles. And he's a stone and earthenware. He has a stone and earthenware factory in the industrial non-population schedule in 1880. Below him is Benjamin Franklin Landrum and John Lewis Miles, the son of Lewis Miles. So how do I know Wash Miles is African American? Well, here's his 1880 census entry, and it says that he is African American, as well as his wife Harriet and his son George. So I have one person, but I have no connecting evidence. So then I look for the closest pottery, and interestingly, it happens to be the Siegler pottery on Shaw's Creek that we just talked about, where the Phoenix Factory pottery was, the Collin Rhodes pottery was, and later the Siegler factory. I want to call attention to another name on this list, and the only reason I noticed it is because in a completely nerdy fashion, I made a database of these census pages, and the name is Joe Ranford. And here's a John Siegler pottery piece that you can see across the street, dated 1854. Some of you may have seen this particular piece, which is found at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And I come to this piece because when I hit a dead end in the documents originally, I thought, well, maybe I should look at other pieces of Edgefield District stoneware that are signed or incised. So I knew that this had an incision on it, incised writing on it based on the accession card, but I didn't know what it looked like. And so I emailed the Smithsonian, and I got some pictures in return. And if you follow the letters around, it's definitely not easy to see. It says Joe Ranford. And you recall that picture, that individual was on the 1880 census page one slide ago. And again, remember the R and the F. So this now ties the tombstones to another piece of ceramics in that the letters do seem to have been incised, although kaolin's not applied by the same individual. And just another shot of F.E. Justice Maker for comparison. So then if I looked further into the 1880 census, as I learned that both Family Search and Ancestry.com don't do a very good job of indexing names. So if we look, we see John Siegler at the top, and we see Joe Ranford, whose name is on the face jug. And then if we continue to look below, we see Wash Miles and his family, and living in the same house, I finally found him. It's Fortune Justice. Could this be F.E. Justice? And also living in the house, coincidentally, is Brister Jones, who is the son of Mark Jones and is identified as a potter. Now, what's interesting about this is, as with other potters in the Edgefield area and pottery owners, and I think Brenda touched on it earlier, they all seem to marry each other. Or they have affiliated families. And so researching the family of Wash Miles, I encountered Harriet Miles. And I found it very interesting that Harriet is actually the sister of a man named Squire Pope. And not only is she the sister of Squire Pope, but that particular Squire Pope, whose father's name is Wade Pope, can be found in probate documents. His grandfather's name was Squire Pope, and so there's some naming commonality there. In the past, this has been interpreted as Squire Pofu, and there was a very nice article written in Ceramics in America, and maybe it does say Pofu, but there's a lot of coincidence. And this is actually at the Chipstone Foundation. So 2 days ago, I've been following F.E. Justice for about 3 years, and 2 days ago, I actually found his signature. And the great thing about this signature in a document which was in a dusty box of miscellaneous documents in Aiken County is that it happens to be, if you look at the top, it happens to be an addendum to Benjamin Franklin Landrum's will in 1887. So it directly connects Justice with the Benjamin Franklin Landrum pottery, and on the census document previously, indirectly with the Siegler pottery, but definitely in the Edgefield district. And so here we have the census document again from 1880. And interestingly, we'll go back a further generation by looking at a Freedmen's Bureau document from January 1866 for Benjamin Franklin Landrum. And if you look at the arrows at the top, you can see Benjamin Franklin Landrum, and then at the bottom you can see this is a labor contract to make and sell stoneware for B.F. Landrum. And at the bottom you see a familiar name. You see the name of Dave. And you can say that, well, he didn't sign his name, but these are actually transcribed copies of the documents, so he wouldn't necessarily have signed because a lot of literate individuals actually do not sign on these particular types of documents. And then up above in the mid section of the page, you see the name Wash. And so currently I'm trying to prove the relationship between Wash Miles, the potter, and the boy who was working for the potter Dave and at the pottery owned by B.F. Landrum in 1866. And then we'll go back farther. We'll go back to 1847. And this is the probate document of Reverend John Landrum, who owned a pottery And on the first line, you'll see the slaves that were sold, and you'll see a man named Dave who was sold to Benjamin Franklin Landrum for $1,800. It's hypothesized that that is David Drake, and that he later became property again of Lewis Miles, who coincidentally in this particular sale bought Phil, who actually happens to be a potter named Philip Miles. And so, in conclusion, I don't have an answer as to how the face jugs and the use of kaolin application in the eyes and the teeth are related to the tombstones, but I do feel that the technique is similar, it's similar media, and they were made in a similar area and are worthy of more exploration. And I feel that in particular, because for example, with Kate's presentation, she had a lot of beautiful documents, which in Edgefield we don't have, that it's important to use whatever information you have available, rather direct or indirect, to make an inference or a correlation. And so as a final thought, the extraction of detailed information from documents still has the potential to provide indirect evidence which may be correlated and used to further Southern ceramic studies. Thank you. I hope that remotely made sense.